All right. We have our seventh matchup of our wide receiver one elimination bracket challenge. Now, this bracket's just pitting the wide receiver ones against each other as we do our preparation for the upcoming fantasy football year. And in this matchup, we have the Miami Dolphins' Tyreek Hill going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' Mike Evans. Once again, we have a Florida matchup here, so this one should be exciting. Before we jump into the prior year stats, let's go ahead and discuss some of the offseason moves that each team made to see how it's going to impact this upcoming season. So for the Miami Dolphins, they did acquire quarterback Zach Wilson. He will serve as a backup to Tua. Tua in recent years has had a hard time with injuries, specifically concussions. We never know when watching Tua if the next hit is going to be the last hit or the last play that we ever see from him. So fingers crossed that's not the case. And they brought in a very capable quarterback in Zach Wilson. They did acquire guard James Daniels in order to help support that offensive line. They acquired wide receiver Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, and they also acquired Alexander Mattison at the running back position to help with the departure of Raheem Mostert. Another notable departure for the Miami Dolphins was the guard Robert Jones. Now, when we shift over to Tampa Bay, there hasn't been much action in terms of offensive free agent signings. They did re-sign wide receiver Chris Godwin, so that's huge for Mike Evans and his impact when it comes to fantasy as well as the game in general. And they did re-sign guard Ben Bredson, which will help with that offensive line and protecting Baker Mayfield. So, not much in the terms of offseason moves for Tampa Bay. Miami, we're switching guards, so we'll see how well the line gels, if they're going to be able to protect Tua. And with that, let's jump into the prior year stats. So when we pull up the prior year stats, let's start with Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill had 7 weeks where he was a bust, and that includes 3 weeks where he was a boom. He ended up 23rd in the player rankings. His best week of the season came in week 14 against the New York Jets, where he had a stat line of 10 receptions for 115 yards and 1 touchdown on 4 targets. He did have 1 carry for 6 yards in that game, and he finished with 28.1 fantasy points. The 10 receptions was a season high, but the other categories, none of them were season highs. When we switch over to Mike Evans had 4 weeks where he was a bust and 6 weeks where he was a boom. He finished 7th in the player rankings, and he did his best week came in week 15 against the Los Angeles Chargers, where he had 9 receptions for 159 yards, 2 touchdowns on 11 targets. So that was a pretty impressive game. He had season highs in receptions, yards, and he tied a season high in touchdowns during that game. It wasn't the most targets that he had seen, but the efficiency is what matters. One important detail when we're looking at Mike Evans is you'll notice that he missed 3 weeks. That was weeks 8, 9, and 10. He rested up for the bye week, and then he came back very strong to close out the season. So let's shift to the season totals, starting with Tyreek Hill. On the season, Tyreek Hill had 81 receptions for 959 yards. He had 6 touchdowns on 123 targets. He had 8 carries for 53 yards and 0 touchdowns. He finished the fantasy season with 218.2. Mike Evans had 74 receptions for 1,004 yards on the season. He had a total of 11 touchdowns on 110 targets. So Tyreek Hill did have 13 more targets, but he only was able to get 7 more catches than Mike Evans. Mike Evans almost doubled Tyreek when it comes to touchdowns, which was a big difference between them. And Mike Evans ended up finishing the season with 240.4 points, and that includes those 3 missed weeks. So that's a pretty big deal. If he had played, he probably would have broken the top 5 in the player rankings. All right, so we've reviewed the offseason moves. We reviewed the prior season stats. Both of these players are starting to get a little bit older when it comes in terms of the age of the position. When it comes to Tyreek Hill specifically, it truly does seem that his success relies on Tua being healthy and them being able to string together several games, as well as having a supporting running attack. I'm not sure if the addition of Madison's going to be able to serve that purpose, but time will tell. For Evans, the re-signing of Chris Godwin, as long as he comes back 100% healthy, is going to be huge. Baker Mayfield has been looking pretty solid over the past couple of years. There's a very good chance that Tampa Bay will also make another run at the playoffs. When we switch over to the Dolphins, their biggest competition is going to be within the division in the Buffalo Bills. They should fare very well against the New England Patriots and Drake May, as well as the New York Jets and whoever ends up being the quarterback for them this year. So I'm going to give the nod to Mike Evans over Tyreek Hill. Now, this is because of the consistency at the quarterback position, as well as the supporting help that Mike Evans is going to get from the other receivers. So he might not get 100 receptions on the year or break 15,000 receiving yards, but I'm pretty confident that we're going to see more than 11 touchdown receptions from him. So he's going to be able to accumulate a lot of fantasy points in that regards. And I wouldn't be surprised, similar to the prior year, if we see multiple games where he has multiple touchdowns. So Mike Evans, you are our winner, and you will advance to the second round. Tyreek Hill should have stayed in KC, my man. Okay, now that we have the bracket up, let's take a peek at the winners of the first round who have already advanced to the second round of our elimination bracket. In round 1, Xavier Worthy lost to Khalil Shakir. Lad McConkey was able to overcome Jerry Jeudy. DJ Moore advanced over Christian Watson. Brian Thomas Jr. blew out the Mario Douglas. And Justin Jefferson gets grandfathered in. We had an emergency matchup between George Pickens and DK Metcalf due to the offseason trade. DK Metcalf is now playing on the Steelers. DK to advance, but you'll notice that DK will now have to face off against Michael Pittman Jr. in that first round. All right, so things are starting to get a little exciting as we keep getting further and further into this bracket. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, Terry McLaurin ended up beating Calvin Ridley. That one was another blowout. Not that Calvin Ridley isn't a fantastic route runner and can't get separation. There's just some issues with the delivery system in Tennessee, so we'll see what happens as we continue through the offseason. We get into the draft and what that depth chart is truly going to look like come week 1. The next matchup that we're going to be covering is going to be Malik Neighbors for the New York Giants going up against Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. I played against Neighbors twice last year, and he had... I know he did very well in fantasy. I don't recall Deebo making any big splashes, even though he should have been set within that offense to kind of carry them moving forward. Jawan Jennings came on very strong. I even think he might be favored as the WR2 on that team, but we'll see how things shake up. And with that being said, see you in the next one.